nearby tent. "Wait until you see Mrs. Bird's knitting. She's on a winning streak." "Look at her needles," agreed Judy. "They're going like windmills. I hope she doesn't do herself a mischief."
"I expect she could do with a marmalade sandwich,"
said Paddington.
"I brought something specially." "Don't stop, Mrs. Bird,"
he called.
"I'm coming."
The Brown's housekeeper had her hands full, so he popped a sandwich into her open mouth. Mrs. Bird gave a gurgle, but she didn't slow down. "That's torn it," said Judy. "If Mrs. Bird gets marmalade all over her needles, she won't be pleased." "It's probably against the rules to feed competitors," said Mr. Brown. Jonathan gave a groan. "Oh, what's Paddington up to now?" he said.
"I found some more wool if you run out, Mrs. Bird,"
called Paddington. Spluttered Mrs. Bird, shaking her head violently. Paddington set to work. He had his back to Mrs. Bird, so he didn't notice that as he wound the wool into a ball, her piece of knitting grew smaller and smaller. Said Mrs. Bird. "How on earth did he manage to do that?" asked Mr. Brown. "Don't even ask, Henry," replied Mrs. Brown. "Oh, Bango's our last chance of a prize," groaned Judy. "We can't give up now," said Jonathan. "They're getting ready for the relay race. Who's for making up a foursome?" Paddington's paw shot up. Judy raised her hand, and after a moment Mr. Brown joined them. "In for a penny, in for a pound," he said. Judy made the first circuit of the track before passing the baton to Jonathan, who in turn passed it to Paddington. "Whatever you do," he gasped, "don't drop it." Mr. Brown was ready and waiting as a familiar figure rounded the bend. "Where is it?" he cried as Paddington drew alongside him. "The baton! Where is it?"
"I don't know, Mr. Brown,"
gasped Paddington.
"I had it when I left."
"You had it when you left?" repeated Mr. Brown. "What do you mean? You had it when you left?" Paddington did his best to think of another way of saying it.
"Jonathan told me not to drop it,"
he said.
"So I put it somewhere for safekeeping."
"I don't believe it." Groaned Mr. Brown. As the race came to an end, everybody cheered and began waving their hats in the air. So Paddington joined in. "There it is," cried Mrs. Brown, pointing